Good morning. Good morning from Lithuania. It is cold and dark and -2. Today we're going to discuss the issue of Christian disruptors in the 20th century. On another occasion, perhaps, I will discuss the nature of religious disruption in Lithuania for its many interesting aspects. However, today are the Christian disruptors of the 20th century. That requires us to define two words. What is a Christian? That is very hard to define and would be a lesson in itself. However, let's just start by saying that a working definition is someone who generally agrees with the Nicene Creed. What is a disruptor? A person who challenges the established dogma or institutions of the church or the society in which the church exists. An agent of change or attempted change in people's outlook or their institutions in the community, including the church. The issue of Christian disruptors raises an interesting paradox, and that is that religions hold themselves out to be stable and permanent, if not eternal, in their beliefs and practices. The paradox is that a religion that resists change risks becoming irrelevant to its societies and its members. As a simple test of this proposition, all we need to do is consider the nature of the church as we understood it when we were young people and compare it with the church today. In various instances, simple things such as women priests and ministers, attitude towards homosexual ministers, the nature of congregational conduct, and the nature and extent of interdenominational exchange are all things that have massively changed in the last 50 years. Full stop. The question that has to be asked is what is necessary, what is desirable. Churches are inherently resistant to change, but failure to change could imperil their future. Perhaps the largest example of disruption in the Christian communities is the Reformation. That was a process that was initiated by a series of massive social changes in Europe in the 15th century, in specifically the mass depopulation of the country caused by plague, where somewhere between 30 and 40% of the population died, which changed the balance between the power of the landed and the power of those with labour and skills, and the introduction of printing, which allowed for dissemination of ideas relatively cheaply. The printing also highlighted the importance of domestic languages rather than the lingua franca of Latin. This created more opportunity for nationalist and regional variation in belief within the Christian community. The institution of the church was itself vulnerable because of large aspects of corruption, which is exhibited by some of the most notorious behaviour of the Renaissance popes, in addition to the issues of the payment for indulgences to avoid spending time in purgatory. The net result of this was the rise of a series of Protestant churches which have gone on to challenge the Church of the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox since that time. So what are the changes in the 20th century that have laid the foundation or the opportunity for the disruptors? The 20th century is probably, and the early 21st century is probably the largest amount of social change in the history of mankind. The most fundamental change to our society has been the emancipation of women and the arrival of cheap, universally available contraception. This has been a revolution in the role of women, which is without equal in the entire social development of humankind, and certainly back 3,500 years to the decline of the fertility goddess. The next has been the rise of nationalism and the move for the self-determination of peoples. This has created literally hundreds of nations in the 20th century. In addition has been the rise of the middle class, mass consumerism, and the development of social democracy. Add to that these developments occurring while at a political level there has been the destruction of empire and monarchy consistently, from the collapse of the major empires of the Ottomans, the Romanovs, and the Hohenzollerns at the end of World War I, through the decline of the British Empire in the post-war period and the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 20th century. These are seen against a backdrop of global war and man-made catastrophes. In the man-made catastrophes, I specifically make reference to the Great Leap Forward, the Holodomor in the Ukraine in the 1930s, and the Gulag process in the 30s and 40s in Soviet Russia. This is all glued together with the arrival of mass media, television, international telephony, and the internet. The ability for people to cheaply communicate in a mass form right across the globe is a revolution in capacity which is without equal. So which disruptors in the 20th century have I chosen? I have chosen, firstly, Archbishop Ramiro of El Salvador, an archbishop who was assassinated while he engaged in public opposition to the repressive regime that existed in El Salvador in the early 1980s. Then Professor Hans Kung, a man who was a colleague of Pope Benedict at Tübingen University in the 1950s and deeply implicated in the Vatican II process, and was generally described as a Catholic theologian, until suffering the ire of John Paul, who prohibited his use of that description and imposed a year of silence upon him. And then finally, to the New Zealand perspective, we have Wiremu Ratana, the founder of the Ratana Church, starting life as a Presbyterian lay minister, and then going on to form his own religious movement, which had a political, and still has, political influence in this country, stretching over 100 years. Who might I have chosen? Here are just some of the potentials, and I invite you to think of your own Christian disruptors from the 20th century, or in fact from earlier centuries. But here are some that immediately came to mind. The Reverend Billy Graham, who was the original mass media preacher of the 20th century, utilizing football stadiums and radio and television to spread his Southern Baptist theology. It is also worthy of note that Billy Graham had close political affiliations and was able, through that, to cast a shadow over the political world of the 50s and 60s, and the subsequent TV evangelists have continued to create mass influence in the American political system up to this very day. Then there is Martin Luther King, the champion of civil rights and civil disobedience and passive resistance, who almost single-handedly established the framework for the true emancipation of Black America, a process that is still going on, but the process is still essentially reliant on legislation that was passed in the mid-60s with the dominant role of Dr. Martin Luther King. Then from a New Zealand perspective, there is Lloyd Gearing, at least at the time, perhaps is the last Protestant theologian to have been subject of a heresy trial, where in the process of his own academic debate and musings suggested that Christian belief was possible with belief in less items than the church normally thought. And finally, Bishop Desmond Tutu, the renowned opponent of apartheid. Let us move on and look at Dr. Hans Kung's recipes for papal ire. Kung challenged the Pope to a large extent on the matter of papal infallibility. On this page are a number of his quotes, but the essence of Kung is he was saying, if you have papal infallibility and an organisation that has a singular, all-powerful leader, that system is subject or prone to error and a greater risk of making fundamental mistakes. In seeing that, he saw that there were mistakes in not adopting some of the initiatives roadmapped by the Second Vatican Council, such as greater roles for women in the church, including ordination, the allowing of priests to marry. These two items alone could have, I would conjecture, have been a great assistance in reducing the risks that the church had with respect to child abuse in its various care institutions. That may be a slightly long bow to draw, but is one I'm willing to discuss. In addition to that, there was, as a very good priestly friend of mine observed, that contraception, although remaining a strong prohibition in the Catholic Church, is much practiced in the congregation. When there is a schism between the theology of the church and the practices of the congregation, when the theological justification for the position on something like contraception does put the church at severe risk. And that is part of the church's ongoing problem. The next matter that arises in part from these is these items were major impediments for the ecumenical movements. The Protestant churches in particular resisted the idea of papal infallibility and were also resistant to prohibitions on women priests and contraception. These remain challenges for the Catholic Church in the 21st century. We now consider the position of Archbishop Ramiro and the ire he generated in the junta of El Salvador. He was a pacifist, but he was willing to speak with vehemence, if not violence, in his words to make the position of the oppressed and downtrodden, particularly of the indigenous populations of El Salvador, which had suffered tens of thousands of deaths at the hands of the junta. It is to be remembered that the political structures of many Latin American countries were dominated by up to 100 families, essentially of pure Spanish heritage, which owned 95 or more % of the assets in the country and dominated the politics and economy of the country accordingly. What Archbishop Ramiro did was publicly disengage and disassociate with the junta. This was in stark contrast to the rest of the Catholic hierarchy that remained as part of a wedded establishment religious institution. The remarks such as, when the church hears the cry of the oppressed, it cannot but denounce the social structures that give rise to and perpetuate the misery from which the cry arises. It is from such words that Archbishop Ramiro was assassinated by a sniper's bullet. A sniper or its planners, none of which have been brought to book in the last 30 years. It is ironic that although Archbishop Ramiro was denounced at the time by his religious leaders in El Salvador and Latin America, he has gone on to be beatified. He has been subject of some debate as to whether he was a liberation theologist. In my opinion, he was, although he did not adopt the Marxist aspects of liberation theology in the analysis. He merely saw it as a process whereby the church needed to engage in removing poverty and inequality from a society in which it operated, and to actively challenge repressive regimes and provide an engagement with repressive regimes that moved towards their elimination. We finally move on to Wiremu Ratana. Ratana started his religious movement before World War I, and he continued in this area throughout the rest of his life. But unlike most religious leaders, his position was very political. One of the absolute cornerstones of his belief was Titiriti, the Treaty of Waitangi. He accepted the prophecy of the great Northern Ariki Apahama, who said the treaty will only be understood when someone comes with the treaty in one hand and the Bible in another. This proposition is one that I hope to explore with you on another day. However, the fundamental point is that Wiremu Ratana's position was primarily one where he saw the treaty and engagement with the colonial institutions as a method of lifting his congregation out of economic deprivation. He moved forward, and in very specific ways, he created a political alliance with the Labour Party in the 1920s that formally continued to operate until the foreshore and seabed legislation of 2004. It still is part of every Labour Party year that every September there is a pilgrimage to the Ratana Marae in the Whanganui area. As he said, we want to build a relationship with all political parties so that we can be part of the decision-making process and development of policy. To the conventional churches, that seems a remarkable statement to make. And there has frequently been suggestions by political leaders that churches should stay out of politics. However, there has always been that conflict within many churches that when there is social evil or social deprivation, it is a duty of the church to make comment. Wiremu Ratana's objects of disruption, the honour of Titaliti, to lift his people from poverty, to provide them with a voice in government, and to address the impact of colonisation. All these represent today for Maoridom a task in progress. They are not complete, but they are substantially closer than they once were. What are the lessons for us from these Christian disruptors? How is our church not responding to its community? What are the elements that restrict our ability to change? How can change be managed if it is desirable? Our church community has gone through quite radical change in the last 1 or 2 years as we are merging of two church communities, be they of a common denominational heritage. But still, we are left with a congregation whose average age is probably generously in the low 70s. What is the challenge that we do not become like the Shakers and gradually die out? How do we rejuvenate ourselves? Part of the process of looking at that may be to ask you, which are the disruptors that you relate to? Which are the elements within our church that require most urgent action? And with those thoughts, I wish you a pleasant morning.